Hey there, night owls and insomniacs. If you're here because you can't sleep and need a good story to drift off to, well, you might want to reconsider this one. Because tonight we're diving into religious history so scandalous it might actually keep you awake. Imagine popes buying their way to power, turning the Vatican into a brothel, and literally putting dead bodies on trial. Welcome to medieval Christianity, where the men closest to God were often the furthest from grace. Now, when you think of the Pope, you probably picture a humble, holy man in white robes, blessing crowds and preaching about love and forgiveness, right? Well, buckle up because we're about to shatter that image completely. We're talking about popes who murdered their way to power, had multiple wives and mistresses, sold church positions to the highest bidder, and turned the holiest place on earth into what can only be described as a medieval Game of Thrones with more sex and somehow even more violence. These weren't just bad priests having a midlife crisis. These were the supposed representatives of God on earth who made modern politicians look like saints. Picture this. It's the year 897, and in the most sacred halls of the Vatican, a grotesque trial is taking place. The defendant? A corpse. Yes, you heard that right. They literally put a dead pope on trial, propped up his rotting body in a chair, and accused him of crimes while maggots fell from his decomposing face. And that's just the appetizer in our feast of papal madness. We'll meet Pope Alexander VI, who bought his way to the top and then turned the Vatican into his personal family business, appointing his illegitimate children to high positions and throwing orgies that would make Hugh Hefner jealous. There's Pope John XII, who was so debauched that he transformed the sacred Lateran Palace into a brothel where cardinals paid for blessed prostitutes. And then there's Pope Julius II, who was so obsessed with warfare that he personally led armies into battle, swinging swords and shouting battle cries while wearing his papal robes. These stories sound like they're straight out of a satirical comedy, but here's the terrifying truth. Every single detail is documented historical fact. We're talking about an era when becoming pope wasn't about spiritual calling or divine inspiration. It was about having the biggest bank account, the most ruthless assassins, or the best political connections. Imagine if today's megachurch pastors could buy their way to becoming the global leader of Christianity, and then multiply that corruption by about 1,000. The medieval papacy was so corrupt that it eventually triggered the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther basically looked at these guys and said, "You know what? I'm starting my own religion with blackjack and actual moral standards." But before we get to that point, we need to understand how we went from Jesus preaching about poverty and humility to his supposed earthly representatives hosting cocaine-level parties in golden palaces. Tonight's journey will take us through centuries of the most outrageous behavior you can imagine, from popes who sold the papacy itself like it was a used car, to others who put their dead predecessors on trial just for the sheer pettiness of it all. We'll explore how men who were supposed to be celibate ended up with more illegitimate children than a medieval soap opera, and how the supposedly peaceful Vatican became the most violent place in Europe. So settle in because we're about to dive deep into a world where holy water was more likely to be mixed with poison, where prayers were sold to the highest bidder, and where the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" apparently translated to "whatever gets me more power and money." This is the untold story of how Christianity's holiest institution became its most unholy scandal. To understand how the papacy became this cesspool of corruption, we need to travel back to a time when Europe was emerging from the chaos of the Dark Ages, and the Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution, it was the most powerful political force on the continent. Picture medieval Europe as a massive game board where kings, emperors, and nobles are all fighting for control, but sitting right in the middle of it all is this guy in Rome who claims to speak directly for God himself. That's a pretty powerful position to be in, especially when most people couldn't read and genuinely believed that crossing the Pope meant eternal damnation. The papal territories weren't just spiritual domains. They were actual countries with armies, treasuries, and diplomatic relations. We're talking about the Papal States, which covered a huge chunk of central Italy and generated enormous wealth through taxes, trade, and what can only be described as medieval protection rackets. Think of it like this. Imagine if the CEO of the world's largest corporation also claimed to be God's personal spokesperson and controlled his own military. That's essentially what the medieval pope was, part spiritual leader, part political dictator, part mob boss. And just like any powerful position, it attracted exactly the kind of people you wouldn't want anywhere near it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the early days of Christianity, being a church leader was more likely to get you fed to lions than fed grapes by beautiful servants. But by the 8th and 9th centuries, something had fundamentally changed. The Pope wasn't just blessing bread and wine anymore, he was crowning emperors, declaring wars, and controlling more gold than most kingdoms. This shift created what historians call the temporal power of the papacy, where spiritual authority became political authority, and political authority became an opportunity for every ambitious psychopath in Europe to see dollar signs. Or in this case, gold coin signs. The system worked like this. Local nobles and wealthy families would essentially sponsor candidates for papal positions, expecting favorable treatment in return. It was like medieval campaign financing, except instead of promising tax breaks, you were promising eternal salvation or damnation. The papal states needed administrators, generals, diplomats, and tax collectors, which meant hundreds of high-paying positions that could be sold to the highest bidder. We're talking about a time when becoming a cardinal wasn't about spiritual devotion. It was about having enough money to buy your way in, and then using that position to make even more money. Think of it as the ultimate pyramid scheme, except instead of selling essential oils, you were selling salvation. And just like any pyramid scheme, the people at the top made obscene amounts of money while everyone else got screwed. The wealth flowing into the Vatican was absolutely mind-boggling. We're talking about tributes from kings, taxes from entire regions, donations from wealthy families trying to buy their way into heaven, and profits from what was essentially a medieval banking system. The Pope controlled enough gold to fund armies that could challenge emperors, build palaces that made royal courts look modest, and live in luxury that would make modern billionaires jealous. But here's where things get really interesting. This level of wealth and power didn't attract humble monks who wanted to serve God. It attracted ambitious politicians, ruthless businessmen, and outright criminals who saw the papacy as the ultimate prize in a very deadly game. These weren't accidental corruptions or gradual moral decay. We're talking about people who planned their entire lives around acquiring enough wealth and influence to literally buy their way to becoming God's representative on earth. The irony is absolutely delicious when you think about it. Jesus, who preached about giving away all your possessions and loving your enemies, somehow ended up being represented by men who hoarded gold like dragons and murdered their rivals like mafia bosses. It's like if Mother Teresa's organization was taken over by Gordon Gekko, except even more morally bankrupt because these guys were claiming divine authority for their actions. And the best part? The more corrupt they became, the more money they made, and the more money they made, the more corrupt they could afford to be. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of awfulness that would make modern corporate scandals look like parking violations. So by the time we get to our first major scandal, and trust me, we're about to dive into some truly unbelievable stories, the papacy had already transformed from a spiritual calling into a corrupt political machine that would have made ancient Roman emperors proud. The stage was set for centuries of the most outrageous behavior imaginable, and our first pope is about to show us exactly how low the bar could go. Now that we understand how the papacy became this medieval superpower, let's talk about what daily life was actually like inside the Vatican during these wild times, because honestly, it was like lifestyles of the rich and famous meets the Sopranos, with a dash of religious ceremony thrown in for appearances. Picture walking into the papal palace and being greeted by scenes that would make a Roman emperor blush. We're talking about halls lined with pure gold, tables groaning under the weight of exotic foods that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and servants whose job it was to literally taste the Pope's food to make sure it wasn't poisoned. Yes, you heard that right, papal food tasters were a real thing, which tells you everything you need to know about how much these holy men trusted each other. The Vatican had become this bizarre fusion of sacred and profane, where you might see a cardinal blessing a crowd in the morning and then find him in a silk-lined bedroom with 3 mistresses by evening. Nepotism wasn't just accepted during this period, it was practically a job requirement. The word nepotism literally comes from the Latin nepos, meaning nephew, because popes were so notorious for appointing their nephews to high positions that it became the standard term for corruption. And I put nephews in quotes because half the time, these weren't actually nephews, they were the Pope's illegitimate sons, and everyone just pretended otherwise because calling them nephews was slightly less scandalous than admitting the supposedly celibate Pope had been very, very busy. We're talking about a culture where having multiple mistresses wasn't seen as breaking your vows, it was seen as a perk of the position. Cardinals would openly live with women they called their housekeepers, and these housekeepers somehow managed to give birth to children who looked suspiciously like their employers. The mental gymnastics required to maintain these pretenses would have impressed Olympic athletes. Money flowed through the Vatican like water through a broken dam, and just like water, it found every possible crack and crevice to seep into. Church positions were bought and sold so openly that there were literally price lists. Want to be a bishop? That'll cost you this much. Archbishop? Higher price. Cardinal? Hope you've got deep pockets. It was like a medieval catalog where instead of ordering household goods, you were ordering religious authority. The justification for all this excess was absolutely mind-boggling. These popes convinced themselves that living in obscene luxury was actually honoring God. After all, shouldn't God's representative on earth have the finest of everything? It's like they read the part of the Bible where Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple and thought, you know what? He was probably just having a bad day. The papal court became this magnet for every ambitious schemer in Europe. Young men from wealthy families would arrive in Rome with bags of gold and dreams of power, ready to buy their way up the ecclesiastical ladder. It was like a medieval Ivy League, except instead of studying law or medicine, you were studying how to maximize bribes and minimize moral qualms. The irony reached absurd levels when you consider that these same men were supposed to be preaching about humility, poverty, and spiritual devotion. Sunday sermons about the evils of greed were delivered by men wearing robes worth more than entire villages, standing in churches decorated with enough gold to fund small wars. It's like having Jeff Bezos lecture people about the importance of living simply while standing on a pile of money. But here's the thing that really gets me. This wasn't considered unusual or scandalous by the standards of the time. This was just how the Vatican operated. Corruption had become so normalized that what would shock us today was simply Tuesday for them. Cardinals planned their corruption like modern CEOs plan quarterly earnings, and the only real scandal was getting caught doing it badly, not doing it at all. The papal household included positions like keeper of the Pope's pleasure gardens, master of papal entertainment, and other jobs that definitely weren't mentioned in the Bible. There were entire departments dedicated to managing the Pope's various romantic interests, because apparently divine inspiration came with a very active social calendar. Meanwhile, outside the Vatican walls, regular people were living in poverty, dying of diseases, and genuinely believing that their suffering was God's will, while just a few miles away, God's supposed representative was living like a Roman emperor with unlimited credit cards. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system was absolutely staggering. But all of this extravagance and normalized corruption was just setting the stage for our first real scandal, and trust me, what comes next makes everything I've just described look like a church potluck dinner, because we're about to meet a pope who took medieval madness to levels that defy human comprehension. And now we arrive at our first mind-blowing scandal that perfectly illustrates just how completely unhinged the medieval papacy had become. The story of Pope Stephen VI and what historians call the Cadaver Synod, which sounds like the name of a death metal band but was actually one of the most grotesque events in papal history. Picture this. It's January 897 and Stephen VI, who had recently clawed his way to the papal throne through the usual combination of political maneuvering and probably a few well-placed bribes, decides he has a serious problem with his predecessor, Pope Formosus. Now you might think, well, that's politics, right? New boss doesn't like the old boss's policies? Except here's the kicker, Formosus had been dead for about 7 months. But Stephen VI, in a move that would make even the most vindictive reality TV star say, dude, that's too far, decided that being dead wasn't going to stop him from putting Formosus on trial for his alleged crimes. So Stephen VI ordered his guards to march into the papal tomb, dig up Formosus's decomposing corpse, dress it in full papal vestments, and drag it into the papal court for what can only be described as the most morbid legal proceeding in human history. Imagine walking into the most sacred court in Christendom and seeing a rotting cadaver propped up in a chair, still wearing the papal crown, while maggots literally fell from its face onto the marble floor. The smell alone must have been absolutely apocalyptic. We're talking about a 7-month-old corpse in an era before embalming, sitting in what was supposed to be the holiest courtroom on earth. Stephen VI, apparently not bothered by the fact that his defendant was clearly not going to be offering much in the way of cross-examination, proceeded to scream accusations at the corpse like it was some kind of medieval Weekend at Bernie's situation gone horribly wrong. The charges against the dead pope included violating canon law, obtaining the papacy illegally, and my personal favorite, perjury, which is particularly impressive considering the defendant was literally incapable of speech due to being dead. Stephen VI ranted and raved at the decomposing body, demanding answers from someone who was physically incapable of providing them, while a room full of cardinals and bishops watched this macabre theater with what I can only imagine was a mixture of horror and the kind of morbid fascination you can't look away from. A deacon was assigned to speak for the corpse, which meant some poor guy had to stand next to a rotting body and try to mount a legal defense for someone who had been worm food for months. I genuinely can't imagine what was going through that deacon's mind. Like, do you object to leading questions? Do you request a recess so your client can decompose in private? The whole trial was clearly a kangaroo court, except kangaroos have more dignity than this situation. The predetermined verdict was guilty on all charges, because apparently Stephen VI had never heard of the concept of overkill, which is ironic considering his defendant was already very thoroughly killed. As punishment for his crimes, Formosus was subjected to what they called damnatio memoriae. Basically, they tried to erase him from papal history entirely. They stripped the corpse of its papal vestments, cut off the 3 fingers of his right hand that had been used for blessing, and then threw the body into the Tiber River like they were disposing of evidence from a mob hit. The symbolism was clear. Not only was Formosus's papacy declared invalid, but all of his ordinations and appointments were retroactively cancelled, which created absolute chaos throughout the church hierarchy because suddenly dozens of bishops and priests were told their positions were illegitimate. But here's where the story gets even more insane, if that's possible. The corpse of Formosus apparently didn't stay in the Tiber. According to contemporary accounts, fishermen pulled the body out of the river, and when they brought it back to Rome, miracles allegedly started happening around it. People claimed the corpse was performing healing miracles, which must have been really awkward for Stephen VI, who had just spent considerable time and energy proving that this same corpse was an evil criminal deserving of eternal damnation. The whole episode perfectly encapsulates the murderous pettiness, political vindictiveness, and complete moral bankruptcy that characterized the worst papal era, and it's just the beginning of our journey into papal insanity. Stephen VI's decision to put a dead man on trial wasn't just crazy, it was the kind of crazy that makes you wonder how anyone could take the institution seriously ever again. And yet, somehow, this was just Tuesday for the medieval Vatican, because things were about to get so much worse that the Cadaver Synod would start looking like one of the more reasonable papal decisions of the era. With public outrage reaching fever pitch and Stephen VI's reputation in complete freefall, the political and religious authorities who had initially supported his papacy began plotting against him with the kind of medieval efficiency that would make modern conspiracy theorists weep with envy. The cardinals, who had sat through the Cadaver Synod in horrified silence, started holding secret meetings that were less like ecclesiastical councils and more like planning sessions for a very holy coup. Picture these supposedly sacred men huddled in dimly lit chambers, whispering about how to remove their own pope without technically committing the sin of rebellion against God's appointed representative. It's like a theological ethics puzzle with life or death stakes. The Roman aristocracy, meanwhile, had their own reasons for wanting Stephen VI gone, because having a completely insane pope was terrible for the city's reputation and even worse for their business interests. Rome's economy depended heavily on pilgrims, church officials, and diplomatic visitors who came to the Eternal City expecting to encounter the majesty of papal authority, not witness a man having arguments with decomposing corpses. Local nobles who had investments in everything from luxury goods to religious artifacts were watching their profits evaporate as word spread that Rome's spiritual leader had lost his mind entirely. The conspiracy against Stephen VI brought together the strangest collection of allies you could imagine. We're talking about deeply religious cardinals working alongside cynical politicians, reform-minded bishops collaborating with corrupt aristocrats, and everyone united by the simple understanding that their pope had crossed a line from which there was no return. It was like a medieval version of that moment when every political party agrees that someone has to go, except instead of impeachment proceedings, they were planning something considerably more permanent. The plotting intensified when reports began arriving that other European rulers were questioning Rome's stability and considering whether they needed to take direct action to restore sanity to the papacy. The Byzantine emperor was making diplomatic inquiries about the mental state of the Western Pope. Various kings were expressing concerns about Stephen VI's fitness to lead Christianity, and some were even suggesting that perhaps it was time for a new papal election. Nothing motivates Roman political action quite like the threat of foreign intervention, especially when that intervention might threaten the independence and authority of the papal territories. The final straw came when Stephen VI, apparently not content with having prosecuted one dead body, began making noises about putting other deceased popes on trial as well. The cardinals realized that if they didn't act quickly, their pope might turn the entire papal cemetery into his personal courtroom, which would have made the Vatican look less like the center of Christianity and more like the world's most expensive mental institution. Secret messages began flying between conspirators faster than medieval Twitter, with coded language that would have impressed Cold War spies. Phrases like, "the shepherd has lost his flock," and "the vineyard needs new tending" became ways of discussing papal assassination without actually using words that could be considered treasonous. The plan that emerged was elegantly simple in its medieval brutality. They would arrest Stephen VI on charges of violating canon law, imprison him in the papal dungeons, and then let nature take its course. Of course, letting nature take its course in medieval Rome usually meant helping nature along with a convenient strangulation, because apparently even papal conspirators believed in efficiency. The arrest came swiftly and without warning. Stephen VI was seized by his own guards during what he thought was a routine morning prayer session, which must have been quite a shock for a man who had spent months believing he was untouchable. The irony of God's supposed representative being arrested in the middle of praying was probably lost on Stephen VI, but it certainly wasn't lost on the Romans, who celebrated the news like they'd just been liberated from a particularly unpleasant foreign occupation. Within days of his arrest, Stephen VI was found dead in his cell, officially from natural causes but realistically from the kind of natural causes that involved someone's hands around his throat. The speed and efficiency of his elimination suggests that his conspirators had learned something from watching Stephen VI's own rise to power, namely that in papal politics, hesitation can be fatal and mercy is a luxury that leaders can't afford. The death of Stephen VI marked the end of one of the shortest and most bizarre papal reigns in history, but it also established a precedent that would haunt the papacy for centuries to come. If you crossed enough of the right people, not even claiming divine authority could save you from a very earthly and permanent solution. The message was clear. There were limits to how crazy a pope could be before even his most loyal supporters decided that perhaps God needed a new representative, and Stephen VI had blown past those limits like a medieval missile heading straight for moral bedrock. Just when you think we've reached the bottom of papal depravity with Stephen VI's corpse prosecuting madness, along comes Pope John XII to show us that the Vatican's capacity for scandal was deeper than anyone could have imagined, because this guy basically looked at the concept of holy behavior and decided to do the exact opposite of everything on the list. John XII became Pope in 955 at the tender age of 18, which should have been everyone's first clue that putting a teenager in charge of the most powerful religious institution in Europe might not end well, but apparently the lesson about young people and unlimited power hadn't been invented yet. Picture the most irresponsible college freshman you've ever met, give him absolute authority over the church, unlimited access to wealth, and zero adult supervision, and you'll start to understand what happened when John XII took over the papacy. This wasn't just a case of a young man sowing his wild oats. This was a systematic transformation of the holiest place in Christianity into what can only be described as a medieval Playboy mansion with religious decorations. John XII didn't just bend the rules of papal conduct. He took those rules, set them on fire, and used the ashes as decoration for his orgies. And yes, I said orgies because apparently hosting massive sex parties in the papal palace was John XII's idea of spiritual leadership. The sacred Lateran Palace, which was supposed to be a place of prayer, contemplation, and holy administration, became the site of what contemporary chroniclers described as unspeakable debaucheries that would have made Roman emperors blush with embarrassment. We're talking about a pope who turned bishops into pimps, cardinals into party planners, and the holiest chambers in Christianity into rooms where people paid money for what they called blessed encounters, with prostitutes who had supposedly been sanctified for their sacred work. The mental gymnastics required to justify prostitution as a religious service would have impressed Olympic athletes, but John XII managed to convince himself and his followers that sexual pleasure could be a form of worship if it happened in the right location with the proper ecclesiastical oversight. The Pope's daily schedule apparently looked less like a religious leader's agenda and more like a party planner's dream. Mornings were for gambling with church funds, afternoons for drinking wine that cost more than most people's annual income, and evenings for hosting elaborate sexual festivities that featured entertainment you definitely wouldn't find at your average church social. John XII had a particular fondness for dice games, which he played using sacred church vessels as stakes, because apparently betting the Holy Grail on a lucky roll seemed like perfectly reasonable papal behavior to him. The prostitutes who worked in the papal palace weren't just random street workers. They were allegedly blessed by John XII himself, which meant that customers could claim they were participating in a religious ritual rather than just paying for sex, creating what might be the most creative theological loophole in human history. Imagine walking into the Vatican expecting to receive spiritual guidance and instead finding yourself in a situation where cardinals were offering you a choice between confession and what they euphemistically called sacred physical communion, with women who had been personally sanctified by the Pope. The corruption reached such absurd levels that John XII actually started selling religious positions to fund his parties. Becoming a bishop wasn't about spiritual calling anymore, it was about having enough money to keep the papal entertainment budget well funded. Church appointments became party favors, with John XII literally handing out religious authority to anyone who could contribute to his next feast or provide interesting entertainment for his guests. The sacred ceremonies that were supposed to honor God became elaborate productions designed to impress the Pope's party guests, with religious rituals being performed by drunk priests for audiences that were more interested in the after-party than the actual spiritual content. Contemporary accounts describe scenes where Holy Mass would be interrupted by gambling disputes, where sacred hymns were replaced by drinking songs, and where the papal throne was sometimes occupied by women who definitely weren't wearing traditional religious attire. John XII's interpretation of blessing the faithful apparently included activities that would have required a completely different kind of biblical interpretation, and his understanding of laying on of hands was so creative that it probably violated several commandments simultaneously. The transformation of the Vatican into a medieval party palace wasn't just personally scandalous, it was institutionally devastating, because pilgrims from across Europe would arrive expecting to encounter the majesty of Christian leadership and instead find themselves in what appeared to be a very expensive brothel with unusually elaborate religious decorations. But John XII's reign of hedonistic madness was about to face a serious challenge, because there was one person in Europe who was definitely not amused by the Pope's creative interpretation of Christian leadership, and that person happened to control the largest army on the continent. Just when you think we've reached the bottom of papal depravity with Stephen VI's corpse prosecuting madness, along comes Pope John XII to show us that the Vatican's capacity for scandal was deeper than anyone could have imagined, because this guy basically looked at the concept of holy behavior and decided to do the exact opposite of everything on the list. John XII became Pope in 955 at the tender age of 18, which should have been everyone's first clue that putting a teenager in charge of the most powerful religious institution in Europe might not end well. But apparently the lesson about young people and unlimited power hadn't been invented yet. Picture the most irresponsible college freshman you've ever met, give him absolute authority over the church, unlimited access to wealth, and zero adult supervision, and you'll start to understand what happened when John XII took over the papacy. This wasn't just a case of a young man sowing his wild oats. This was a systematic transformation of the holiest place in Christianity into what can only be described as a medieval Playboy mansion with religious decorations. John XII didn't just bend the rules of papal conduct. He took those rules, set them on fire, and used the ashes as decoration for his orgies. And yes, I said orgies because apparently hosting massive sex parties in the papal palace was John XII's idea of spiritual leadership. The sacred Lateran Palace, which was supposed to be a place of prayer, contemplation, and holy administration, became the site of what contemporary chroniclers described as unspeakable debaucheries that would have made Roman emperors blush with embarrassment. We're talking about a pope who turned bishops into pimps, cardinals into party planners, and the holiest chambers in Christianity into rooms where people paid money for what they called blessed encounters, with prostitutes who had supposedly been sanctified for their sacred work. The mental gymnastics required to justify prostitution as a religious service would have impressed Olympic athletes, but John XII managed to convince himself and his followers that sexual pleasure could be a form of worship if it happened in the right location with the proper ecclesiastical oversight. The Pope's daily schedule apparently looked less like a religious leader's agenda and more like a party planner's dream. Mornings were for gambling with church funds, afternoons for drinking wine that cost more than most people's annual income, and evenings for hosting elaborate sexual festivities that featured entertainment you definitely wouldn't find at your average church social. John XII had a particular fondness for dice games, which he played using sacred church vessels as stakes, because apparently betting the Holy Grail on a lucky roll seemed like perfectly reasonable papal behavior to him. The prostitutes who worked in the papal palace weren't just random street workers. They were allegedly blessed by John XII himself, which meant that customers could claim they were participating in a religious ritual rather than just paying for sex, creating what might be the most creative theological loophole in human history. Imagine walking into the Vatican expecting to receive spiritual guidance and instead finding yourself in a situation where cardinals were offering you a choice between confession and what they euphemistically called sacred physical communion, with women who had been personally sanctified by the Pope. The corruption reached such absurd levels that John XII actually started selling religious positions to fund his parties. Becoming a bishop wasn't about spiritual calling anymore, it was about having enough money to keep the papal entertainment budget well funded. Church appointments became party favors, with John XII literally handing out religious authority to anyone who could contribute to his next feast or provide interesting entertainment for his guests. The sacred ceremonies that were supposed to honor God became elaborate productions designed to impress the Pope's party guests, with religious rituals being performed by drunk priests for audiences that were more interested in the after-party than the actual spiritual content. Contemporary accounts describe scenes where Holy Mass would be interrupted by gambling disputes, where sacred hymns were replaced by drinking songs, and where the papal throne was sometimes occupied by women who definitely weren't wearing traditional religious attire. John XII's interpretation of blessing the faithful apparently included activities that would have required a completely different kind of biblical interpretation, and his understanding of laying on of hands was so creative that it probably violated several commandments simultaneously. The transformation of the Vatican into a medieval party palace wasn't just personally scandalous, it was institutionally devastating, because pilgrims from across Europe would arrive expecting to encounter the majesty of Christian leadership and instead find themselves in what appeared to be a very expensive brothel with unusually elaborate religious decorations. But John XII's reign of hedonistic madness was about to face a serious challenge, because there was one person in Europe who was definitely not amused by the Pope's creative interpretation of Christian leadership, and that person happened to control the largest army on the continent. John XII's return to Rome was like watching a medieval horror movie sequel where the villain comes back from the dead, except in this case, the villain was very much alive and had spent his exile time plotting revenge with the kind of creative vindictiveness that would have impressed Shakespearean villains. In February 964, while Otto I was back in Germany handling other imperial business and probably assuming the John XII problem had been permanently solved, the deposed pope snuck back into Rome with a small army of supporters who were either extremely loyal or extremely well paid, and immediately set about proving that his time away had only made him more dangerously unhinged. The first sign that John XII's comeback was going to be even more disturbing than his original reign came when he started systematically hunting down everyone who had supported his deposition, and by hunting down, I mean literally ordering their torture and execution with the kind of methodical cruelty that suggested he'd spent his exile time reading instructional manuals on creative revenge. Pope Leo VIII, the man Otto I had installed as John XII's replacement, fled Rome faster than you could say hostile takeover, leaving behind a papal throne that John XII reclaimed with all the subtlety of a medieval tank rolling through a flower garden. But John XII wasn't content with simply resuming his old position. He wanted to send a message that crossing him had consequences that would haunt people's nightmares, so he began what can only be described as a papal reign of terror that made his previous orgies and gambling look like innocent entertainment. The returned pope ordered the mutilation of Cardinal John, who had been instrumental in his deposition, commanding that the cardinal's right hand be cut off and his fingers amputated as punishment for having signed the document deposing him, because apparently John XII believed in very literal interpretations of an eye for an eye. Bishop Otgar, another conspirator against John XII, was subjected to what contemporary accounts describe as cruel tortures before being exiled, while other clerics who had supported the deposition were either executed, mutilated, or forced to flee Rome in the middle of the night like they were escaping from a slasher film. John XII's revenge spree turned the Vatican into a place where cardinals and bishops lived in constant fear of their own pope, wondering whether each day might be their last if they happened to remind him of his recent humiliation at the hands of Otto I. The theological implications of having a pope who was literally torturing and murdering his own clergy were staggering. Here was a man who claimed to be God's representative on earth, but was acting more like a medieval serial killer with unlimited authority and a really good costume. John XII's second reign lasted only about 10 months, but he managed to pack more horror and scandal into that short period than most people could achieve in a lifetime, proving that experience really does make you better at your chosen profession, even when that profession is being a completely corrupt religious leader. The end came in May 964, when John XII died suddenly under circumstances that were officially described as natural but unofficially whispered about as divine intervention, because even in an era accustomed to papal corruption, people found it hard to believe that God would allow such behavior to continue indefinitely. But if you think John XII's story represents the absolute bottom of papal corruption, then buckle up, because we're about to meet Pope Benedict IX, who looked at everything John XII had accomplished and thought, "Hold my communion wine, I can do worse." Benedict IX became pope in 1032 when he was somewhere between 18 and 20 years old, which should have been everyone's first clue that the church hadn't learned anything from the John XII experience about giving teenage boys unlimited power and authority. This kid didn't just inherit the papacy through normal succession. He bought it through his family's wealth and political connections, establishing a precedent that would make papal elections look less like divine inspiration and more like medieval eBay auctions where the highest bidder got to represent God on earth. Benedict IX's reign was marked by scandals that were so outrageous and continuous that contemporary chroniclers basically gave up trying to document them all, instead settling for general descriptions like unspeakable acts and abominations that shame the church, which in medieval terms was the equivalent of saying, "This guy is so corrupt that we literally don't have words to describe it." But Benedict IX's most innovative contribution to papal corruption wasn't his personal behavior, it was his business model, because this enterprising young pope figured out something that none of his predecessors had considered. If people could buy their way into the papacy, then surely the papacy itself could be sold for the right price, creating what would become the most literal example of religious capitalism in human history. Benedict IX's brilliant business insight that the papacy could be sold like a used chariot created what might be the most absurd transaction in religious history, but it also triggered a chain reaction of conflicts that would make medieval Game of Thrones look like a peaceful family dinner, because apparently selling the most powerful religious position on earth doesn't come with a clear instruction manual or customer service department. The problem started when Benedict IX decided he wanted to get married, which posed a significant theological challenge since popes were supposed to be celibate, but rather than let a little thing like sacred vows interfere with his romantic plans, he came up with what he thought was a creative solution. He would simply sell the papacy to someone else and use the money to fund his new married life. In 1045, Benedict IX approached his godfather, Giovanni Gratiano, and offered to sell him the papal throne for what contemporary sources suggest was an enormous sum of money, essentially creating the world's first religious franchise opportunity where you could literally buy your way into being God's representative on earth. Gratiano, who took the name Gregory VI upon his purchase, probably thought he was getting a good deal until he realized that buying the papacy was like buying a haunted house. You might own the property, but that doesn't mean the previous occupants are actually gone. Benedict IX took the money and left Rome to pursue his marriage plans, but apparently married life didn't live up to his expectations, because within a year he was back in Rome claiming that his sale of the papacy had been invalid and demanding his job back, creating a situation where two different men were simultaneously claiming to be the rightful pope. This would have been confusing enough, but the situation got exponentially worse when a third faction decided that both Benedict IX and Gregory VI were illegitimate, and they elected their own pope, Sylvester III, who added his name to what was rapidly becoming the most crowded papal election in history. Picture the chaos. You've got Benedict IX insisting he's still the real pope because you can't actually sell a divine appointment, Gregory VI claiming he's the legitimate pope because he bought the position fair and square, and Sylvester III arguing that he's the only valid pope because the other two are both products of corruption and simony. Meanwhile, the regular clergy, bishops, and cardinals were stuck trying to figure out which pope they were supposed to obey, which papal decrees were valid, and whether they should be getting their instructions from the pope who sold his position, the pope who bought it, or the pope who claimed both transactions were invalid. The theological implications were staggering. If the papacy could be bought and sold like property, what did that mean for the divine authority that supposedly came with the position? If Benedict IX could simply change his mind about selling his papal authority, did that mean papal decisions were reversible based on personal convenience? And if three different men could all claim to be pope simultaneously, how was anyone supposed to know which one was actually speaking for God? The conflicts weren't just theological, they were intensely practical because each of the three competing popes had his own supporters, his own financial backers, and his own ideas about how the church should be run, creating three separate papal administrations that were all trying to operate simultaneously in the same city. Benedict IX controlled certain parts of Rome and the Vatican with the support of his powerful family. Gregory VI maintained his own papal court with the backing of reformist clergy who believed his purchase of the papacy was actually a legitimate way to remove the corrupt Benedict IX. And Sylvester III operated from his own base of power with supporters who rejected both of the other claimants as fundamentally illegitimate. The result was a papal civil war that split the church hierarchy down the middle, with bishops choosing sides based on political expediency rather than theological conviction, cardinals switching allegiances based on which pope offered the best career opportunities, and lower clergy simply trying to keep their heads down while their supposed spiritual leaders fought like medieval warlords over who got to wear the fancy hat. Rome itself became a battleground where different neighborhoods supported different popes, creating a situation where you could walk a few blocks and find yourself in territory controlled by a completely different papal administration with different laws, different ceremonies, and different claims about divine authority. The chaos reached such ridiculous levels that pilgrims arriving in Rome had to ask which pope they were supposed to visit for their blessing. Merchants had to figure out which papal treasury they were supposed to pay their taxes to, and diplomatic visitors from other countries had to decide which papal court they should present their credentials to without accidentally insulting the other two competing administrations. This wasn't just a religious crisis, it was a complete breakdown of institutional authority that threatened the very foundation of medieval Christianity, and it demonstrated that when you combine unlimited power with unlimited corruption, the result isn't just moral decay, it's administrative chaos that makes normal government dysfunction look like a model of efficiency and organization. Faced with the absolutely unprecedented situation of three different men simultaneously claiming to be God's representative on earth, The church hierarchy decided they needed to call in the big guns to sort out this mess, and by big guns I mean the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, who was probably sitting in Germany wondering how Christian leadership had managed to turn into a theological version of a really dysfunctional reality TV show. Henry III looked at the situation in Rome, where you had Benedict IX, Gregory VI, and Sylvester III all insisting they were the real pope while their supporters engaged in what can only be described as medieval papal gang warfare, and decided that the only solution was to fire everybody and start over, which is essentially the medieval equivalent of turning a computer off and on again when it's completely frozen. In 1046, Henry III marched into Italy with his army and called for the Synod of Sutri, which sounds like an important theological conference but was basically an imperial intervention where the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire told all three competing popes, "You're all fired, we're having new elections, and this time we're going to have adult supervision." The synod proceedings were like watching a medieval divorce court where everyone involved was guilty of something, because Henry III quickly determined that Gregory VI was guilty of simony for buying the papacy, Sylvester III was guilty of usurping papal authority, and Benedict IX was guilty of pretty much everything else, including selling a religious office that was supposed to be divinely appointed and then trying to take it back like he was returning a defective product to a medieval Walmart. The solution Henry III proposed was elegantly simple and completely unprecedented. He would depose all three competing popes and appoint his own candidate, essentially turning the papal election into an imperial appointment and solving the problem of church corruption by putting the church under direct government control, which was either a brilliant administrative solution or a complete violation of the separation between religious and secular authority, depending on your perspective. The newly appointed Pope Clement II was probably the most reluctant religious leader in history, having essentially been handed a job that had recently driven three previous occupants into open warfare with each other. But Henry III's logic was that appointing a German bishop who had no connections to Italian politics would break the cycle of corruption that had turned the papacy into a medieval auction house. The irony of the situation was absolutely delicious. The church, which claimed spiritual authority over all earthly rulers, had become so corrupt that it needed a secular emperor to restore basic sanity to its leadership, essentially admitting that divine inspiration wasn't working as well as imperial administrative efficiency. But if you think this imperial intervention solved the papal corruption problem, then you clearly haven't been paying attention to how medieval politics actually worked, because within 2 years Clement II was dead under mysterious circumstances that may or may not have involved poisoning, and guess who immediately showed up to reclaim the papal throne like a bad penny that keeps turning up? That's right, Benedict IX was back for round 3 of his papal career, proving that getting rid of a corrupt pope was like trying to eliminate cockroaches. Just when you think you've solved the problem, they come crawling back more resilient than ever. Benedict IX's third stint as pope lasted less than a year, but it established a precedent that would haunt the church for centuries. Once you've been pope, apparently you never really stop thinking of yourself as pope, regardless of how many times you've been deposed, excommunicated, or replaced by imperial decree. The whole episode demonstrated that the church's institutional problems ran so deep that even direct imperial intervention couldn't permanently fix them, because the underlying issue wasn't just corrupt individuals, it was a corrupt system that attracted corrupt individuals like a medieval magnet for moral dysfunction. Henry III's attempted solution had temporarily restored order, but it also created a new problem. If emperors could appoint and depose popes at will, what happened to the church's claims of independence from secular authority? The Synod of Sutri might have ended the immediate crisis of the three competing popes, but it opened up entirely new questions about who actually controlled the church and whether divine authority could be trumped by imperial convenience when religious leaders became too corrupt to function effectively. The stage was now set for even more creative approaches to papal corruption, because if buying and selling the papacy hadn't worked, and if imperial intervention only provided temporary solutions, then clearly what the church needed was someone with a completely different approach to combining religious authority with personal enrichment, and that someone was about to arrive in the form of the most notorious papal family in history. And now we arrive at the moment that makes everything we've discussed so far look like minor administrative hiccups, because in 1492, the same year Columbus was discovering America, Europe was about to discover that papal corruption could reach levels that would have made ancient Roman emperors say, "Dude, that's too much, even for us." Enter Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal who looked at centuries of papal scandals and apparently thought, "Those are rookie numbers, I can do much better," before proceeding to transform the papacy into what can only be described as a medieval crime family with religious decorations and international recognition. Rodrigo Borgia didn't just want to be pope, he wanted to establish a papal dynasty that would make the Medici family look like amateur hour, and he was willing to spend whatever it took to make that happen, which in this case meant literally buying the papacy in what was essentially the most expensive auction in religious history. The 1492 papal election wasn't really an election at all. It was a bidding war where Rodrigo Borgia systematically purchased the votes of cardinals through a combination of gold, land grants, church positions, and promises of future wealth that turned the College of Cardinals into the world's most expensive and corrupt board of directors. We're talking about bribes so massive that some cardinals received entire cities as payment for their votes, while others were promised cardinal positions for their relatives, creating a situation where the papal election resembled a medieval corporate merger more than a spiritual calling. When the votes were counted and Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, he had essentially purchased the most powerful religious position on earth for what modern economists estimate would be hundreds of millions of dollars, making him probably the most expensive employee in human history. But here's where the story goes from merely corrupt to absolutely mind-blowing. Alexander VI didn't even pretend to hide his corruption or maintain the appearance of spiritual leadership. Instead, he openly treated the papacy like a family business and the Vatican like his personal corporate headquarters, appointing his illegitimate children to high church positions and turning papal politics into a literal family affair. His son Cesare Borgia became a cardinal at age 17, not because of any spiritual calling but because daddy needed someone he could trust to handle the family's religious operations, while his daughter Lucrezia was married off to various Italian nobles in strategic alliances that strengthened the Borgia family's political power throughout Italy. Alexander VI didn't just have mistresses. He had an official mistress, Giulia Farnese, who was known throughout Europe as the Pope's whore, and who lived openly in the Vatican like a first lady, attending papal ceremonies and entertaining diplomatic visitors as if she were the Pope's actual wife. The sight of the supposedly celibate Pope appearing at official functions with his beautiful mistress, while his illegitimate children occupied high church positions and used their religious authority to advance the family's political interests, must have been absolutely surreal for visiting diplomats who had come expecting to meet a holy man and instead found themselves in what appeared to be a very wealthy and very corrupt medieval soap opera. Alexander VI's approach to papal authority was so blatantly nepotistic that he actually created new church positions specifically to give his children more power and wealth, essentially treating the church hierarchy like his personal employment agency where family members got the best jobs regardless of their qualifications or spiritual fitness. The theological implications were staggering. Here was a man who claimed to be God's representative on earth, but who was openly living like a secular prince with multiple romantic relationships, illegitimate children in high religious positions, and a governing style that prioritized family enrichment over spiritual leadership. What made Alexander VI's papacy even more shocking was his complete lack of shame about any of it. He hosted elaborate parties at the Vatican where cardinals and church officials would mingle with his mistresses and illegitimate children, creating scenes that would have scandalized ancient pagans but were apparently just Tuesday evening entertainment for the Borgia Pope. The famous Banquet of Chestnuts in 1501 was reportedly an orgy hosted by Alexander VI in the papal palace, where prostitutes and cardinals engaged in activities that definitely weren't mentioned in any religious texts, proving that the Pope's idea of spiritual fellowship had evolved considerably from the original Christian model. Contemporary accounts describe papal dinners where church officials would compete to see who could seduce the most prostitutes, while Alexander VI presided over these festivities like a medieval Hugh Hefner with religious authority and unlimited funding. The Borgia papacy represented the complete abandonment of any pretense that the church was a spiritual institution rather than a political and economic enterprise, and Alexander VI's shameless nepotism and open corruption would establish new standards for papal scandal that would influence church politics for generations to come, proving that when it comes to combining religious authority with personal enrichment, creativity and shamelessness can achieve results that are both historically unprecedented and morally incomprehensible. The truly terrifying thing about Alexander VI's corruption wasn't just that he was personally immoral, it was that he used his papal authority to unleash his children onto the political landscape of Renaissance Italy like medieval weapons of mass destruction, and their actions would reshape European politics in ways that are still being felt today, because Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia didn't just inherit their father's corruption, they weaponized it and turned it into a political strategy that would influence everything from Machiavelli's political philosophy to the rise of modern diplomacy. Cesare Borgia, armed with papal armies and unlimited Vatican funding, embarked on a military campaign to conquer central Italy that was so ruthlessly efficient it inspired Niccolò Machiavelli to write The Prince, essentially making the Pope's son the poster child for amoral political leadership and the foundation of modern political theory. Picture this. While other European rulers were still pretending their authority came from God and trying to maintain at least the appearance of moral legitimacy, Cesare Borgia was openly demonstrating that political power came from superior organization, better funding, and a willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in your way, regardless of moral considerations or traditional legal constraints. Machiavelli, who served as a diplomatic observer during Cesare's campaigns, was so impressed by the papal son's combination of strategic brilliance and complete moral flexibility that he basically used him as the model for his ideal ruler in The Prince, creating a political philosophy that would influence European statecraft for centuries and establishing the principle that effective leadership sometimes required abandoning traditional moral constraints. Meanwhile, Lucrezia Borgia was being used by her father as a human political treaty, married off to various Italian nobles and strategic alliances that strengthened papal control over Italian territories, but unlike typical arranged marriages where the bride was expected to be a passive political pawn, Lucrezia proved to be just as ruthlessly intelligent as her father and brother, actively participating in the political machinations that were reshaping the Italian peninsula. The Borgia family's political activities during Alexander VI's papacy directly contributed to the Italian Wars, a series of conflicts that would rage from 1494 to 1559 and fundamentally alter the balance of power in Europe, because their aggressive expansion of papal territories and their interference in the politics of Italian city-states created the conditions that drew major European powers into what became a continental struggle for control of Italy. French kings, Spanish monarchs, and Holy Roman emperors all found themselves drawn into Italian conflicts that had been either initiated or intensified by papal political ambitions, proving that when the Pope decides to play medieval Risk with real armies and actual territories, the consequences can escalate into international warfare pretty quickly. The irony is absolutely delicious when you consider that Alexander VI, who was supposed to be a peacemaker and spiritual leader, was actually one of the primary instigators of military conflicts that would devastate Italy for over half a century and establish patterns of European warfare that would persist well into the modern era. Cesare Borgia's military innovations, funded by church resources and justified by papal authority, introduced new standards of political ruthlessness that other rulers felt compelled to match, essentially creating an arms race in amorality that elevated the general level of political corruption throughout Renaissance Europe. The diplomatic strategies developed by the Borgia family, including the use of strategic marriages, political assassinations, and the systematic bribery of church officials, became standard practices that were copied by other ruling families, making the papal court a kind of graduate school for political corruption that trained the next generation of European leaders in advanced techniques of amoral statecraft. Even after Alexander VI's death in 1503, the political precedents established by his family continued to influence European politics, because other rulers had learned that combining religious authority with military power and strategic corruption could achieve results that traditional diplomatic methods couldn't match, creating a new model of aggressive papal politics that would be adopted by future popes who wanted to compete effectively in the increasingly complex world of Renaissance power. Politics. The connections between Alexander VI's corruption and broader historical developments extend even further when you consider that the Protestant Reformation, which would split Christianity permanently and reshape the religious landscape of Europe, was directly triggered by the kind of papal corruption that the Borgia family had perfected and normalized. Martin Luther's famous protest against church corruption wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was a direct response to the systematic abuse of religious authority that had been exemplified by Alexander VI and his family, making the Borgia papacy one of the primary catalysts for the most significant religious revolution in European history. The legacy of Alexander VI's reign demonstrates how individual corruption can have massive historical consequences, because when the person who claims to speak for God starts acting like a medieval crime boss, the resulting loss of institutional credibility can trigger changes that affect millions of people for centuries to come, proving that papal scandals aren't just entertaining historical anecdotes. They're actually major factors in the development of modern European civilization. Just when you think we've reached the absolute peak of papal insanity with Alexander VI turning the Vatican into a family crime enterprise, along comes Pope Julius II to prove that there's always room for innovation in the field of religious corruption. Because this guy looked at centuries of papal scandals and decided that what the church really needed was a pope who would personally lead armies into battle while wearing full armor over his papal robes, essentially creating the world's first warrior priest who treated military conquest as a form of divine worship. Julius II, who became pope in 1503, was nicknamed Il Papa Terribile, the terrible pope, not because he was bad at his job, but because he was so intimidatingly effective at combining religious authority with military violence that even hardened Renaissance warlords found him genuinely frightening, which is quite an achievement when you consider that these were people who were accustomed to pretty extreme levels of political brutality. Picture this absolutely surreal scene. The year is 1506, and the armies of the Papal States are besieging the fortress of Mirandola, but instead of the Pope staying safely in Rome and blessing the troops from a distance like any sensible religious leader would do, Julius II is right there in the trenches, wearing armor that had been specially designed to fit over his papal vestments, personally directing artillery fire while shouting battle commands and probably some very unpapal language at enemy fortifications. Contemporary accounts describe Julius II climbing siege ladders, inspecting defensive positions under enemy fire, and engaging in what can only be described as hands-on military leadership that would have impressed Alexander the Great. Except Alexander never claimed to be God's representative on earth while he was conquering territories for personal glory. The sight of the Pope of Rome, successor to St. Peter, personally leading cavalry charges against enemy positions while his papal banner flew alongside military standards must have been absolutely mind-bending for everyone involved. Because here was a man who was supposed to be preaching peace and love, literally making war his primary occupation and treating battlefield victory as evidence of divine favor. Julius II didn't just command armies, he genuinely enjoyed warfare with the kind of enthusiasm that most people reserve for their favorite hobbies, spending his papal income on cannons and siege equipment with the same passion that other religious leaders might spend on charitable works or church construction, proving that when you combine unlimited funding with a complete misunderstanding of Christian theology, you can achieve some truly spectacular results. The theological implications of having a pope who personally killed people in battle were staggering, because Julius II wasn't content to simply order military actions from the safety of his papal palace. He wanted to be on the front lines, sword in hand, personally demonstrating that Christian leadership in the Renaissance meant being willing to spill blood for territorial gain while wearing religious vestments. His military campaigns weren't defensive actions to protect church territories, they were aggressive wars of conquest designed to expand papal political power throughout northern Italy, with Julius II using his religious authority to justify what were essentially medieval land grabs conducted with Renaissance military technology and papal funding. The Pope's personal military gear included specially designed armor that allowed him to wear his papal robes underneath, creating an image that perfectly captured the bizarre fusion of religious and military authority that defined his papacy. Imagine seeing God's supposed representative on earth charging into battle while wearing a combination of sacred vestments and lethal weaponry, and you'll start to understand why Julius II's contemporaries found him both inspiring and terrifying. Julius II's approach to papal diplomacy involved showing up at enemy cities with large armies and personally threatening to destroy anyone who opposed papal authority, which was either a very creative interpretation of Christian evangelism or a complete abandonment of everything Jesus had taught about turning the other cheek, depending on your theological perspective. The sight of the Pope personally directing siege warfare while his cardinals followed behind him like a heavily armed religious procession must have been one of the most surreal spectacles in military history, combining the pageantry of religious ceremony with the brutal efficiency of Renaissance warfare in ways that probably violated several commandments simultaneously. Enemy commanders facing Julius II's forces had to deal with the psychological challenge of fighting against someone who claimed divine authority for his military actions, because how do you develop effective battlefield tactics against an opponent who believes God is personally directing his artillery placement and cavalry maneuvers? Julius II's reign represented the ultimate fusion of spiritual authority and military power, creating a papacy that was less like a religious institution and more like a theocratic military dictatorship where papal bulls were issued between battles and religious ceremonies were conducted in army camps, proving that when you give someone unlimited religious authority and unlimited military funding, the result isn't necessarily spiritual enlightenment. Sometimes it's just a really well-funded warlord with excellent religious marketing and a tendency to settle theological disputes through superior firepower and strategic territorial acquisition. By the early 16th century, the Christian population of Europe had endured centuries of papal corruption that ranged from merely embarrassing to absolutely horrifying, but Julius II's warrior pope antics were apparently the final straw that broke the back of popular tolerance for religious leadership that had completely abandoned any pretense of spiritual authority in favor of political power and military conquest. Picture the average European Christian sitting in their local church, listening to a priest talk about Jesus' teachings on peace and humility, while knowing that the Pope was literally leading armies into battle and personally killing people for territorial gain. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain faith in that system would have challenged even the most devoted believers. The reaction wasn't immediate or coordinated, but it was building like pressure in a medieval steam engine that was about to explode, because people throughout Europe were starting to ask some very uncomfortable questions about how the representative of a religion founded on love, forgiveness, and poverty had somehow become a warrior prince who lived in golden palaces and funded military campaigns with money that was supposed to be used for charitable works. Local priests found themselves in the impossible position of trying to explain papal behavior to their congregations, because how do you tell your parishioners that they should follow the teachings of Christ when Christ's supposed earthly representative was acting more like a medieval warlord than a spiritual leader? The breaking point came when Pope Leo X, Julius II's successor, decided that the Church needed even more money to fund its various projects, including the construction of St. Peter's Basilica and the continued financing of papal military adventures, so he authorized the sale of indulgences on an unprecedented scale, essentially creating a religious marketplace where people could buy their way out of sin and purchase guaranteed admission to heaven for themselves and their deceased relatives. This wasn't just theological corruption, it was spiritual extortion that told people they could literally buy salvation, which directly contradicted everything Christianity was supposed to teach about redemption through faith and good works rather than through financial transactions with church officials. Johannes Tetzel, the German friar who became the most notorious seller of indulgences, was basically running a medieval religious pyramid scheme, traveling from town to town with slogans like, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs," which made salvation sound like a vending machine where you inserted money and received eternal life in return. The sight of church officials literally selling heaven like it was merchandise at a medieval market was finally too much for Martin Luther, a German monk who looked at the systematic corruption of papal authority and decided that enough was enough, that the time had come for someone to say publicly what millions of Christians were thinking privately about the complete moral bankruptcy of their religious leadership. On October 31, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, essentially publishing a point-by-point critique of papal corruption that focused particularly on the sale of indulgences and the broader pattern of church officials using religious authority for personal enrichment rather than spiritual guidance. Luther's protest wasn't just a theological disagreement, it was a direct challenge to the entire system of papal corruption that we've been exploring, because he was essentially asking whether people who lived like medieval crime bosses could legitimately claim to represent a religion founded on humility, service, and spiritual devotion. The response to Luther's theses was explosive, not because his criticisms were particularly original, but because he had finally said publicly what people throughout Europe had been thinking privately about the gap between Christian teachings and papal behavior, giving voice to centuries of accumulated frustration with religious leaders who preached poverty while living in luxury and taught peace while personally leading armies into battle. Within months, Luther's writings were being circulated throughout Europe, translated into multiple languages, and read by people who had been searching for someone brave enough to articulate their doubts about papal authority and church corruption, creating a religious revolution that would permanently split Christianity and establish the principle that religious authority had to be earned through spiritual leadership rather than inherited through political maneuvering. The Protestant Reformation that followed Luther's initial protest wasn't just a theological movement, it was a popular uprising against centuries of papal corruption that had finally reached levels that even the most tolerant believers couldn't ignore or rationalize, proving that there are limits to how much hypocrisy people will accept from their spiritual leaders, even when those leaders claim divine authority for their actions. The irony is absolutely perfect. The popes who had worked so hard to accumulate political power and personal wealth had ultimately undermined their own religious authority so thoroughly that millions of Christians decided they didn't need papal leadership at all, creating new forms of Christianity that rejected the entire concept of papal supremacy and established direct relationships between believers and God that bypassed the corrupt institutional hierarchy that had grown up around the original Christian message. The legacy of these corrupt popes is so bizarre and far-reaching that it's almost impossible to overstate how profoundly they shaped not just Christianity, but the entire development of Western civilization. Because when the most powerful religious institution in the world spends several centuries being run by murderers, con artists, and literal crime families, the ripple effects extend far beyond church politics and influence everything from art and architecture to international law and modern, democratic principles. The immediate legacy was the permanent fracturing of Christianity itself, because the Protestant Reformation that began with Luther's protest against papal corruption didn't just create a few new denominations. It shattered the 1,000-year monopoly that the Catholic Church had held over European spiritual life, creating dozens of competing Christian traditions that all claim to represent the true teachings of Jesus while explicitly rejecting papal authority as fundamentally corrupt and unreliable. The Council of Trent, which met from 1545 to 1563, was essentially the Catholic Church's attempt to clean up its act after centuries of scandal had driven millions of believers into Protestant churches. But the reforms they implemented were basically admissions that everything the Protestant critics had said about papal corruption was absolutely true, because you don't need to ban the sale of church positions and prohibit bishops from having mistresses unless those things had been serious problems. The architectural legacy of papal corruption is visible throughout Rome today, because buildings like St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, and countless Renaissance palaces were funded with money that was essentially stolen from believers who thought they were contributing to spiritual works rather than financing the luxurious lifestyles of corrupt religious leaders, creating some of the world's most beautiful buildings through some of the world's most morally questionable fundraising methods. The artistic legacy is equally complex, because the same papal corruption that scandalized Europe also funded Renaissance art that we still consider priceless today. Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel were paid for with money from the sale of indulgences, which means that some of the most spiritually inspiring art in human history was created using funds raised through what was essentially religious fraud. The political legacy of papal corruption helped establish the modern principle of separation between church and state, because European rulers who had watched popes act like secular princes for centuries became increasingly convinced that religious leaders shouldn't have political power, and political leaders shouldn't have religious authority, creating constitutional frameworks that specifically prevented the kind of church-state fusion that had enabled papal corruption in the first place. The legal legacy includes the development of modern concepts of institutional accountability and checks on absolute power, because the spectacle of corrupt popes claiming divine authority for obviously criminal behavior forced political theorists to develop new ideas about how to limit the power of leaders who claim to be above human law, contributing to constitutional principles that still govern democratic societies today. Perhaps most bizarrely, the corrupt popes actually strengthened Christianity in the long run by forcing believers to develop more personal and direct relationships with their faith, because when you can't trust religious institutions or their leaders, you have to find God on your own terms, which led to more individualized forms of spirituality that were arguably more authentic than the institutionalized religion that had been corrupted by political power and personal greed. The scholarly legacy includes the development of critical approaches to religious history and the establishment of academic principles that distinguish between spiritual teachings and institutional behavior, because historians studying papal corruption had to develop new methods for analyzing religious institutions that separated theological content from political and economic activities, creating approaches to religious studies that are still used in universities today. The diplomatic legacy influenced the development of modern international law, because the spectacle of popes leading armies and engaging in warfare while claiming spiritual authority forced European powers to develop new concepts of legitimate government and proper diplomatic conduct that excluded religious leaders from military and political activities, establishing precedents that still govern international relations in the modern world. Even the economic legacy is significant, because papal corruption contributed to the development of banking, accounting, and financial regulation systems designed to prevent the kind of institutional theft and mismanagement that had characterized the medieval church, creating economic principles that were specifically designed to make the kind of systematic corruption practiced by corrupt popes impossible in modern institutions. The psychological legacy might be the most important of all, because the example of corrupt popes taught people that institutional authority and moral authority are completely different things, and that impressive titles, beautiful ceremonies, and claims of divine appointment don't automatically make someone trustworthy or spiritually enlightened, creating a healthy skepticism about authority figures that is arguably one of the foundations of modern democratic thinking. The ultimate irony is that these terrible popes, who nearly destroyed Christianity through their corruption and greed, ended up making the religion stronger and more authentic by forcing believers to rediscover what Christianity was actually supposed to be about, proving that sometimes the best way to save an institution is to let its worst representatives expose its flaws so completely that reform becomes inevitable. Now, as we sit here in the 21st century, surrounded by our modern scandals involving politicians, celebrities, and religious leaders, I can't help but think that these medieval popes would have absolutely dominated social media if it had existed back then, because imagine the Twitter feeds, Instagram posts, and TikTok videos we would have gotten from Pope Alexander VI posting thirst traps with his official mistress, or Julius II live streaming his military campaigns with captions like, "Just Conquered another city for Jesus #blessed and armed #papal warrior #God wills it. The tabloid headlines alone would have been absolutely incredible. We're talking about stories that would make modern celebrity gossip look like church newsletters, with medieval TMZ running exclusive exposés like, Pope sells papacy. You won't believe what he did with the money, or 3 popes, 1 throne, the love triangle that shocked Christendom, or my personal favorite, dead pope on trial, exclusive courtroom photos inside. Modern scandal magazines spend millions trying to catch celebrities in compromising situations, but these medieval popes were essentially providing scandalous content 24/7 without even trying to hide it, living their lives like reality TV stars who had never heard of publicists or damage control. Think about how Pope John XII would have handled social media. We'd be getting papal OnlyFans accounts, Instagram stories from Vatican orgies, and YouTube vlogs titled, A Day in the Life of Your Holiest Hookup, with sponsored content from medieval wine merchants and luxury goods sellers who wanted to associate their brands with papal excess and religious authority gone completely wrong. The comment sections on papal posts would have been absolutely vicious, with medieval trolls posting things like, maybe focus more on salvation and less on your side hustle selling church positions? And your dead predecessor called, he wants his dignity back. While papal supporters would be defending their favorite corrupt religious leader with the kind of passionate blindness that makes modern celebrity stan culture look rational and measured. Benedict IX would have been the ultimate influencer, with a personal brand built around the concept that religious authority was just another commodity to be bought and sold, probably launching a medieval cryptocurrency called Popecoin and hosting NFT auctions for blessed papal artifacts, while his followers would be arguing that purchasing spiritual positions was actually a form of innovative religious entrepreneurship. The medieval paparazzi would have had the easiest job in history, because instead of hiding their scandals, these popes were essentially advertising them. Imagine photographers trying to get exclusive shots of papal orgies only to discover that the Pope had already posted the pictures himself with captions like, just another blessed evening at the Vatican #Holy Night Life #Pope Life #blessed and stressed. Julius II would have been the ultimate fitness influencer, posting workout videos titled, How to Stay Papal and Swole, My Crusade Training Routine, and From Holy Water to Holy War, Building Your Battle Body, with sponsored content from medieval armor companies and sword manufacturers who wanted to capitalize on the warrior pope brand. The medieval fact-checkers would have given up entirely, because how do you fact-check claims like, I'm God's representative on earth, when the person making those claims is simultaneously selling religious positions on what was essentially medieval eBay and hosting poker games with sacred church vessels as betting chips. The beauty of these papal scandals is that they were so outrageous they would have broken the modern internet, creating viral content that would have made every contemporary influencer, politician, and celebrity scandal look like minor personality quirks by comparison, because when your religious leader is literally putting dead bodies on trial and selling the papacy like real estate, you've achieved levels of institutional dysfunction that modern corruption can only dream of reaching. Stephen VI would have been the ultimate conspiracy theorist, posting long YouTube videos about how his dead predecessor was still secretly controlling the church from beyond the grave, while Alexander VI would have been running the most successful family business channel on the platform, with episodes like Teaching My Kids the Papal Business and How to Turn Religious Authority into Generational Wealth. The most amazing part is that if these stories happened today, people would assume they were satire or elaborate hoaxes, because even in our current era of political scandals and institutional corruption, the idea of religious leaders selling their positions, hosting orgies in sacred spaces, and personally leading armies into battle while claiming divine authority seems too absurd to be real, proving that medieval reality was stranger than any fiction our modern imagination could create, and that when it comes to combining power, corruption, and religious authority, the past wasn't just a different country, it was a completely different planet where the laws of logic, morality, and basic human decency apparently didn't apply to people wearing fancy religious hats. So what's the moral of this absolutely insane journey through the darkest chapters of papal history? Well, if there's one thing we can learn from watching supposedly holy men transform the holiest institution in Christianity into a medieval crime syndicate with better marketing, it's that power doesn't just corrupt, it corrupts with a creativity and thoroughness that would impress professional criminals. And when you combine unlimited authority with zero accountability, the result isn't spiritual enlightenment, it's a centuries-long demonstration of exactly why absolute power and religious authority should never be combined in the same person, especially if that person has access to armies, treasuries, and the ability to convince people that God personally approves of their most questionable life choices. The irony is absolutely delicious when you consider that these men, who claimed to be the earthly representatives of a guy who preached about giving away all your possessions and loving your enemies, managed to turn Christianity into a system where religious authority was literally for sale to the highest bidder, proving that when it comes to missing the point of your own religion, it's hard to do worse than putting a dead body on trial, hosting orgies in sacred spaces, and personally leading armies into battle while wearing robes that were supposed to symbolize peace and humility. The fact that it took centuries for people to finally say, hey, maybe our spiritual leaders shouldn't be acting like medieval mafia bosses, demonstrates either incredible patience on the part of European Christians or a serious lack of alternative entertainment options. Because honestly, watching these papal scandals unfold must have been like binge-watching the world's most dysfunctional reality TV show, except the characters claimed divine authority and the consequences affected millions of people's eternal souls. If these corrupt popes taught us anything, it's that institutional authority and moral authority are completely different things, and that impressive titles, beautiful ceremonies, and claims of divine appointment are basically just fancy costumes that don't automatically make someone trustworthy, spiritually enlightened, or even minimally decent as a human being, which is a lesson that probably applies to more than just medieval religious leaders, if you know what I mean. The ultimate lesson might be that when someone tells you they speak for God, your first response should probably be prove it, followed immediately by, and by prove it, I don't mean show me how much gold you've accumulated or how many people you can get to bow down to you, because as we've seen, the people who are most eager to claim divine authority are often the ones who are least qualified to represent anything more sacred than a medieval criminal enterprise with excellent public relations and tax-exempt status. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that these terrible popes, despite nearly destroying Christianity through their corruption and greed, actually ended up making the religion stronger and more authentic by being so spectacularly awful that they forced believers to rediscover what their faith was actually supposed to be about, proving that sometimes the best way to save an institution is to let its worst representatives expose its flaws so completely that reform becomes inevitable, like a medieval version of hitting rock bottom before you can start climbing back up. The historical record of papal corruption also serves as a useful reminder that when people start claiming they're above human law because of their spiritual authority, that's probably your cue to start asking some very pointed questions about their finances, their personal life, and their understanding of basic moral principles. Because as we've learned, divine inspiration and criminal behavior are not mutually exclusive, especially when there's money and power involved. In the end, the story of the most corrupt popes in history is really a story about what happens when good intentions meet unlimited power and zero oversight. Spoiler alert. The good intentions don't survive the encounter, but they do leave behind some absolutely incredible historical anecdotes that make modern political scandals look like minor etiquette violations by comparison, reminding us that human nature hasn't changed much over the centuries, just the technology we use to document our moral failures and the speed with which news of those failures spreads around the world. So the next time you're feeling cynical about modern religious or political leaders, just remember that at least they're probably not putting dead bodies on trial, selling their positions to the highest bidder, or personally leading armies into battle while claiming that God told them to do it, which means that despite all our current problems, we've definitely made some progress since the medieval era, even if that progress sometimes feels frustratingly slow and incomplete when measured against the absolutely bonkers standards set by popes who treated the Vatican like their personal playground and Christianity like their family business. But wait, if you think corrupt popes represent the absolute peak of medieval insanity, then you clearly haven't heard about the kings and emperors who were contemporary with these religious lunatics, because while the popes were busy turning the Vatican into a medieval crime syndicate, European royalty was engaged in their own competition to see who could achieve the most spectacular levels of madness while still technically ruling entire countries, and trust me, the stories we're about to explore in our next episode will make papal corruption look like a church picnic compared to the absolute chaos of medieval monarchy gone completely off the rails. Picture this. We're going to meet Emperor Caligula, who made his horse a consul of Rome because apparently he thought his favorite animal was more qualified to run the government than the human senators who had been doing the job, which is either a devastating commentary on Roman politics or evidence that Caligula had completely lost touch with reality, or possibly both at the same time. Then there's King Charles VI of France, who spent 30 years convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him, leading to some absolutely hilarious court protocols where nobles had to approach their king like he was a delicate museum exhibit, while Charles VI himself would stand perfectly still for hours because he was terrified that any sudden movement might cause him to break into a million pieces, creating a royal court that functioned more like a medieval psychological ward than a center of political power. We'll explore the story of Emperor Nero, who didn't just fiddle while Rome burned. He actually set the fire himself and then blamed it on Christians, which was either the most elaborate insurance fraud in ancient history or evidence that when you give someone unlimited power at a young age, they tend to use it for increasingly creative forms of mass destruction and scapegoating. But the real star of our next episode will be King Henry VIII of England, who managed to combine religious authority with political power in ways that made even the corrupt popes look restrained, because Henry didn't just break with the Catholic Church over theological differences. He created his own religion specifically so he could legally murder his wives when they failed to produce male heirs, essentially turning divorce proceedings into capital punishment and making marriage proposals from the King of England sound more like death sentences than romantic gestures. We'll dive deep into the story of Ivan the Terrible of Russia, whose name wasn't hyperbole but rather an accurate description of a ruler who killed his own son in a fit of rage, maintained a personal torture chamber where he would personally participate in the creative interrogation of anyone who displeased him, and established new standards for royal paranoia that would influence Russian politics for centuries to come, proving that absolute power doesn't just corrupt absolutely, it can also drive you completely insane in ways that affect entire civilizations. The upcoming episode will also feature Vlad the Impaler, whose preferred method of dealing with political opposition was so horrifically creative that it inspired the legend of Dracula, except the real Vlad was actually worse than any vampire story because at least vampires usually kill their victims relatively quickly, while Vlad preferred to let people suffer for days while slowly dying on stakes, creating a form of psychological warfare that was so effective it's still being studied by military strategists today. We'll meet King Ludwig II of Bavaria, who spent his country's entire treasury building fairy tale castles while completely ignoring the actual business of governing, essentially turning Bavaria into a theme park funded by taxpayer money and royal delusions of grandeur, proving that when you combine unlimited funding with complete detachment from reality, you can create some beautiful architecture while simultaneously destroying your kingdom's financial stability. And then there's Emperor Commodus of Rome, who was so obsessed with gladiatorial combat that he actually fought in the Colosseum himself, which sounds impressive until you realize that all of his opponents were either unarmed, drugged, or specifically instructed to lose, making him basically the ancient world's most expensive LARPer with delusions of martial prowess and unlimited access to rigged sporting events. The next episode will explore how these royal lunatics shaped European history through their personal madness, creating political systems, military strategies, and cultural traditions that were specifically designed to accommodate the bizarre psychological needs of rulers who had completely lost touch with reality but still controlled vast armies and unlimited treasuries, proving that when you give someone the power of life and death over millions of people, the results can be both historically significant and absolutely terrifying. So if you thought corrupt popes were the worst thing that medieval Europe had to offer, just wait until we explore what happened when the people who were supposed to provide political stability turned out to be even more unhinged than the religious leaders who were putting dead bodies on trial and hosting orgies in sacred spaces. Because apparently medieval leadership positions attracted exactly the kind of people who should never be trusted with any authority whatsoever. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our absolutely wild journey through the dark side of papal history, where we've learned that the men who claimed to speak for God were often the ones who needed to hear from him the most, and where religious authority combined with unlimited power created some of the most spectacular moral failures in human history, proving that when it comes to corruption, creativity, and complete abandonment of basic human decency, nobody could compete with medieval popes who treated the holiest institution in Christianity like their personal playground for power, wealth, and activities that definitely weren't mentioned in the Bible. If you've made it this far through our tour of papal insanity, first of all, congratulations on your strong stomach and your appreciation for historical chaos, and second, I really hope you've enjoyed learning about these absolutely unbelievable stories that somehow actually happened in real life, because honestly, writing a fictional story about popes putting dead bodies on trial, hosting orgies in the Vatican, and personally leading armies into battle would be criticized as unrealistic and over the top, but when it's actual documented history, it becomes the kind of educational content that makes you question everything you thought you knew about religious leadership and human nature. Now, if you found these stories as fascinating and horrifying as I did while researching them, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button, because it helps the YouTube algorithm understand that people actually want to hear about historical scandals that are stranger than fiction, and it encourages me to keep digging up these incredible stories that somehow never made it into most history textbooks, probably because teachers were worried that telling students about papal orgies and corpse trials might undermine their faith in institutional authority, which, let's be honest, might not be such a bad thing. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because we've got so many more incredible historical disasters coming up that your brain might actually explode from the sheer absurdity of what people in the past thought was acceptable behavior for their leaders. And trust me, the upcoming episode about insane medieval kings is going to make these corrupt popes look like they were running a well-organized charity compared to some of the royal lunatics who thought that unlimited political power was licensed to indulge every crazy impulse that crossed their minds. I'm really curious to know what you think about all of this madness we've explored tonight, so please leave a comment and let me know which of these corrupt popes shocked you the most. Was it Stephen VI with his grotesque corpse trial that violated every principle of human decency and legal procedure? Or John XII who turned the Vatican into a medieval brothel that made Roman orgies look like church social events? Or maybe Benedict IX who figured out how to literally sell the papacy like it was a used chariot and then tried to buy it back when married life didn't work out as planned? Or perhaps it was Alexander VI and his Borgia family crime syndicate that treated papal authority like a hereditary business where illegitimate children inherited religious positions and church policy was determined by whoever could bribe their way to the top. Or Julius II who decided that being God's representative on earth meant personally leading military campaigns and killing people in battle while wearing papal robes over armor designed for medieval warfare. The comment section is where we can have some real fun discussing these historical disasters, so please share your thoughts, your favorite papal scandal, or any other crazy historical stories you know that might compete with what we've covered tonight, because I'm always looking for new material and some of the best historical anecdotes come from viewers who remember wild stories their grandparents told them or discovered something bizarre while researching their family history. Also, if you're interested in more content like this, check out some of my other videos where we explore historical scandals, medieval madness, and the kind of true stories that are so unbelievable they make modern conspiracy theories look mundane, because apparently every era of human history has been filled with people who thought that having power meant never having to follow rules, exhibit basic human decency, or explain their behavior to anyone who couldn't afford to buy them off. Thank you so much for spending this time with me exploring some of the most outrageous behavior in human history, for sticking around through stories that were probably more disturbing than anything you've seen on Netflix lately, and for being the kind of audience that appreciates learning about the past in all its chaotic, corrupt, and completely unhinged glory, because understanding how spectacularly wrong things can go when institutions lose their moral compass is probably one of the most important lessons history can teach us, even if that lesson comes wrapped in stories about dead popes on trial and papal orgies that would have made ancient Romans blush with embarrassment. Until next time, keep questioning authority, keep learning from the past, and remember that when someone claims divine authority for their actions, that's probably your cue to start paying very close attention to their behavior and their bank account, because as we've learned tonight, the gap between what people claim to represent and how they actually behave can sometimes be measured in light years rather than inches.